Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Business Process Mapping for Salesforce Admins, our admin webinar for the week. And my name is Jillian Medill. I am a Salesforce admin evangelist. And I'm joined today by our special guest, our business process mapping expert, Squire Kirshner. Squire, say hi.
Hi, everybody.
So we'll hear more from Squire in a minute, but as with every Salesforce presentation, we need to start with our forward-looking statement. Just a reminder that you should only make purchasing decisions based on currently available features and functionality. So with that out of the way, let's get ready for our webinar. So if you have not joined us for a webinar in the past, we want to remind you that you can absolutely interact with us in lots of ways. So follow us on Twitter at SalesforceAdminsNoI. Also follow hashtag AwesomeAdmin. It's a great way to stay in touch with all the exciting things happening in the Salesforce admin universe. And we are on Facebook at Salesforce Admins and YouTube. So this webinar will be recorded. I repeat, this webinar will be recorded, and we will post it on YouTube shortly after we are done with the webinar. So with that out of the way, also want to remind you that you may notice that you can't actually ask a question in the GoToWebinar. There's a good reason for that, because we want you to drive the conversation in our admin webinar group on the success community. Every single person on this webinar should already be a member of the success community. All you need is a Salesforce login to get in there. If you don't have an existing Salesforce org, you can get a free login by signing up for a developer or admin playground edition. And don't wait until the end to ask your questions. So get in there, ask questions. We've got experts standing by live to answer your questions. And it's a great way, too, to interact with the other participants on the webinar. Maybe other people have great ideas as well. And we will have some time for a brief Q&A at the end. So what are we covering today? We're going to give a brief intro to the importance of business process mapping. And then we're going to hear from Squire about lean methodology. And he's going to take us through what that means and how to put it all together, and then we'll give you some resources and end with a Q&A. So let's set some context for why are we doing a webinar about business process mapping? You know, it may not be the first thing you think of about being a Salesforce admin, but as we've learned, being an awesome admin absolutely means that you need to be an awesome process mapper. As an admin, you're really at the core of the business, and it's your job to understand not only the Salesforce technology, but why and where to use the Salesforce technology. You are the one who really needs to know how your business functions, what processes are taking place, and you're the one to really be that problem solver and figure out where to plug in Salesforce. This is how you're really going to drive success to your business. And just as an example, I'm sure all of you have gone through this before, but just for this simple example, imagine that your company uses Salesforce to manage sales, and you've got sales reps printing out spreadsheets to try and track what's going on. But it's your job as an admin to say, hey, wait a second, I can fix that. Let's take a second here. Let's actually look at the process that's causing you to print out these spreadsheets and figure out where I can actually use Salesforce to eliminate that wasted time and effort. And hey, let's save some trees. So with that context out of the way, let me introduce our amazing presenter today, Squire Kirshner. Squire, take it away.
Thanks, Jillian. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Squire Kirshner. I am a certified advanced admin, developer, platform app builder and developer, sales cloud consultant, and I'm pretty pumped to start the architect certifications. And so I've been doing this quite a while, and I'm really privileged to share some of what I've learned over the years with everyone that's joined the call. So thank you very much. So let's start with kind of a little story. A couple weeks ago, I got a call from the head of compliance. They were having some challenges understanding the best way to report some information off of deals. And they gave me a call, and of course, like all admins, we want to be helpful. And right away I said, sure, I'd be happy to give you a hand with that report. And after I hung up the phone, I realized that I hadn't really dealt with the the compliance group very much, and I probably should take a step back and really understand what's going on. And I'm going to leave that story there for right now. We'll circle back to that in a couple minutes. So let's begin with the importance of business process mapping. What is it? Well, it's just a picture. It's really an understanding of what a process represents. It's understanding the inputs, the outputs, the customers, the recipients, the everything that interacts with that flow, who, what, where, why, everything that's being done in that process. So when we start, it can be really straightforward, but there's some really important things to remember when you work through it. And there's some pitfalls you want to try to avoid as you're moving through that process as well. So let's start with the first step, which is really understanding the process. Understand is a big word, but it's really important when you start this process to observe, not interpret it. Don't put your own flavor into it when you start going through this effort, because it can really lead you down the wrong path. And additionally, you also want to make sure you understand the scope of the process that you're working on. If you don't really understand the start and end, you can kind of get in the weeds, but it's also important to not cut yourself off, to not be hard stops on the front and the back. Once you start to understand it, you have to identify all of the consumers, the control points, why the process exists, and start seeing, not interpreting, not analyzing, but seeing the gaps or the risks in that process. And the big challenge there, of course, is to make sure that you don't read into any of it. You understand and identify from the conversations you're having. Once you've made your way through those two steps, the next step is to interview, to really sit down with that initial understanding of the process and get involved with all of the users of that process. Really ask open-ended questions. Really take the time to ask why. Again, you are trying to understand the scope without doing more than information gathering. And as an admin, it's really hard to not jump right to solution. We all want to help our users. We all want to help the person that's on the phone. But if you jump too soon, you're going to end up solving for a problem that doesn't truly exist. After those interviews, and there could be a couple, there could be many, there could be iterations, you sit down and map that process. I suffer from something I call Visio paralysis. Anyone who's not initiated, Visio is a flow charting tool that helps to build flows through a Microsoft application. There's a lot of cool tools. There's a million shapes and colors and arrows, and you can get really mired down with just the tool, trying to get this map done and make it pretty. Don't get stuck in the paralysis of using the tool. Focus on what the map represents. And then once you've got all of those pieces put together, now you start that analysis. But again, we are not trying to solve. We just want to try to understand where the gaps are, identify points of improvement, and then once you've made those steps, you can start talking about how you're going to fix those problems. So once you've kind of got those steps in mind, there's a couple types of process maps that you can use to address the needs. I have kind of a personal process that I go through. I said process again. There's a lot of these. You can go to Google and find 100 different process flows and 100 different methodologies. I really recommend finding one that fits your personal style. Sometimes you have to find one that fits the project you're working on. What I want to walk through is kind of a baseline system that I use to try to get to an end result. And the first step is a SIPOC diagram. It really represents 5 main categories, and they're listed there across the top: the suppliers, the inputs, the process itself, the outputs, and the customers. And if you walk through the steps that are itemized there, you set up the start and end of the process. Maybe you have a couple of major steps in that third column to get a framework, and then back through and understand, well, the process delivers these outputs, who receives these outputs, and then go back to the beginning and get your inputs and identify who's supplying these inputs. After you've got that process mapped out, I take that center column, that process column, turn it on its side and expand it a little bit. Again, it's very high level. You want to make sure you understand the scope of the process and the major milestones within that process. And it might be 2, it might be 10, it really depends on what you're working on. But you're not getting into the weeds just yet on this process. You're trying to understand what the overall process represents. Once I've got this laid out, then I take the next step, which is what is historically called a top-down process. I like to call this my post-it process because what I can do is on a whiteboard in a large meeting room, set up these major headers, and then with Post-it notes, start working through the actual details of each of these steps. There might be one, there might be 100, but with the combination of Post-its and a whiteboard, you can really reassign, reorder, and start thinking about what it looks like on the screen. I also like this model because if you're writing a very complex process builder, a lot of times doing something like this can really help you walk through the steps you're going to need to accomplish while building that process. So I go to this one quite a bit. I tend to stop there, but there's a couple others I wanted to call out. Now we're talking about process flowcharts. We really are now talking about the actual path of the process, the decision points, understanding what each output or input looks like, where the starts and ends of the process are seen. And once you start writing something like this, you can start getting a feel for where there's iterations, where there's maybe unnecessary loops, and really just kind of continue to visualize that map. And then the final sample that I'd like to point out is something called a swim lane or a cross-functional diagram. That layout really is the most granular of the list, and it helps you understand when you're looking at this process, not only the flow of work, but who owns it, where it's shared, again, where the iterations start cycling. There's times where this one is absolutely critical. There's times where this is just Visio paralysis again. So that's your samples. But what I want to focus on next is lean methodology. And what lean methodology represents is, or I should say, what I want to focus on with lean methodology is how it feeds into this mapping process. I'll try to do my best to explain how without getting too far into it, but there's some really important pieces that I want to focus on. So first of all, lean manufacturing is where this started, and it's really just understanding and eliminating waste from a process, from a system. And when you're in manufacturing, it's very easy to look at man hours or piecemeal work or just think about an assembly line. But when you take that same methodology and apply it to software development, there's some minor changes, but it feels the same. You're removing waste from development. You're creating value from development. And that value is really dependent on what is seen, not necessarily what the process is intended to do. So that's, again, going back to our mapping, why it's so important to understand this. And I think that quote is really critical. If there's no value, then it's waste. So thinking about that, let's walk through a couple of the steps that are the tenets of lean software development. And there's 7. And again, similar to process mapping, there is a lot of versions of this. There's a lot of documentation. There's a lot of very smart people who spend their whole lives becoming lean experts. In my case, I like these 7, and fortunately, as it says at the bottom of that slide, Salesforce is already helping us be lean. And I'll focus on a couple of the points that Salesforce and the platform gives us while we work through these tenets. So the first item is eliminating waste, and that's the core of lean. What's important to understand within software development is that understanding what waste represents can sometimes seem misleading. There's a couple items here listed. I think one of the big ones to understand is to make sure that you're not doing more than what is asked, extra features and blowing up a project, handing things off, allowing defects to slide through the process. Those are waste. There's no value there. And if you don't look to remove those from your process, issues. The second bullet is embedding quality. Quality is a heavy word, a big word, but what it really represents is a couple of things. It is avoiding defects, avoiding things that you're going to have to fix later on, and doing things ahead of time to make sure that those defects don't occur. But quality also represents doing the least to generate the most. It's the 80-20 rule is what you'll read about. And it really says that in software development, 20% of the code you write generates 80% of the functionality. And in Salesforce, as an admin, you can see those sorts of comparisons as well. Very often, the biggest piece of a project generates the most impact, and it's the outliers that you spend your time on that maybe isn't so useful. I like to think about Salesforce's add to quality by thinking about things like the Sabwa principles, right? I mean, being an admin, walking around, interacting with people, you're building quality because you're really making sure you understand what the users need. From the platform itself, test coverage, validations, it's really hard to make changes to the platform and break it through the configuration portal and the setup. So, I mean, quality is job one when we're in the platform. The third tenet is creating knowledge. And knowledge generates itself, but it's really important to understand that everything you do generates knowledge. It's really important that there's feedback, that there's an understanding of what the most valuable product, the MVP of an effort is, and that communication is happening all the time to make sure everyone's aware. I really like the bullet point, disciplined experimentation. What it really represents is that when you're working on a project, and especially in the Salesforce platform, it's really easy to know what you want to do to resolve an issue, but there's so many ways to resolve issues, resolve problems, improve processes, that it's important to not just do what you know, but really flex your muscles a little bit and go outside that box. And when it says disciplined, it means you don't run down a rabbit hole, you don't lose track of what you're trying to accomplish, but it's important to try to think outside the box. The fourth bullet is defer commitment. This one took a long time for me to truly understand. It feels counterintuitive. Doing something at the last possible moment seems risky, but what it really represents is making sure that at the time of the decision, you know all the possible information, you have all the possible risks and gaps in mind, and that there's not an opportunity for additional change after that decision. And it's a tenet because if you wait, you can make changes up until that point of release, or you can defer things that are unchangeable. And so it's really important to think about it, not from kind of the tongue-in-cheek, we're not going to do it until the last minute, but more about what this quote represents. I'm not going to read it, but I think it really hits home. And there's the book that's referenced, Lean Software Development, has a lot more to address. So I recommend checking that out. All right, so the next item, delivering fast. So now we're getting more into the programmatic development side of things, but it's really important to make sure that as an admin or as a developer, that you are pushing things through as quickly as possible, and that doesn't mean do the work fast, but making sure that things aren't waiting to be deployed, that changes are accepted, created, and given to your users to make sure that there's plenty of feedback, plenty of opportunity for discussions. And to remember that when you think about this bullet, that speed and quality are not opposite ends of the spectrum. You can be fast and give good quality as long as you plan for it. 6 is respecting people. If I were to say that there's a single tenet that represents who I am as an admin, it is this one. It is so critical to make sure that leaders are allowed to lead, whether you're a personnel leader or a knowledge leader. It's so important to nurture and grow who your users are, who your admins are, who your future developers and architects are going to be, and to really make sure that every voice is important, that you listen, that you absorb, that you ask good questions, that you set a level of trust with everyone you interact with. I like this one a lot. It should probably be number 1 in my opinion. But and then finally, optimize the whole. And Salesforce is always growing. It's always thinking bigger. But as an admin, you have to think bigger. You have to think beyond the scope of what's on your plate to make sure that you never limit yourself. And to make sure that you also don't go the opposite end of the spectrum, which is to break something down so small that you're optimizing granular moments that don't actually generate value as a whole. So that was a really quick version of Lean, but let's try to spin these two things together. Why is Lean and process mapping, why do they work together so well? So remember my conversation earlier about compliance? When I took that call, it could have just been a report, but I knew that I had to know more. And so when I sat down with the head of compliance, we started with a SIPOC and started understanding why they were generating this report, understanding their audit process. And so I walked through the suppliers, the inputs, the outputs, et cetera, and started to get a bigger or a broader understanding of what they were doing. And so in this column here, on the process column, the compliance review was really where I thought the scope of this process lived. But that first interview, I understood that, I have to take a step back. I had to broaden that scope. I didn't have to go too far. I didn't have to talk about the entire history of our deal, but I had to understand at what point compliance cared and what the endpoint was past that report. So I wrote the SIPOC, I pulled the process out, and I turned it on its side and started to do a little bit of deep dive. And so you'll see from the original SIPOC, it was only a couple bullet points, but it turned into 6 major milestones. And then I started my interviews. I started my my whys and my hows and took off my admin hat and put on my BA hat, my business analyst hat, and really wanted to understand what they were dealing with. And as soon as I started breaking down my Post-it note chart, I started to see a lot of opportunities. I wasn't thinking about implementing things like email notifications or scheduled tasks. I just was identifying gaps. Like, for instance, in the compliance column, they're printing out screenshots. It wasn't a report at all. I assumed too early that it was even a report. There were a lot of manual handoffs. I see by doing these steps the opportunities. And once I completed my audit and my interviews and my discussions with the compliance and with the bankers and with the associates, I really finally had a layout that I could then dive into and analyze. And when I start analyzing, I start applying the lean principles. I start thinking about waste. There's a lot of waste in this flow. There are quality issues because of some of the manual and simply not system-based processes. There wasn't a lot of feedback going on between the compliance group and the bankers group to understand why these were challenges. There were these clear handoffs that broke the collaboration, broke the opportunity for discussion. Things were happening in a push methodology versus a pull methodology, which is a lean technique, which simply states that you take stuff when you're ready. You're not pushed tasks or pushed efforts. It wasn't very quick. Lean wants you to be quickly resolving issues and delivering things. This was a long, tedious process with a lot of breaks and a lot of handoffs. And they weren't thinking big enough. There was a lot of legacy information being utilized, and there wasn't a thought of what could be done to improve the tail end. The archival process at the end of this process really represents what needed to be looked at even before they called me. So when I got all done, I took what I knew about processes, I took what I know about lean, I mixed it all up, and I came up with some recommendations and some suggestions. And hopefully in the next release, I'll be working on some compliance improvements. And with that, I think I've confused everyone, and thanks for joining me.
That was really great, Squire. We've got a really lively discussion happening on the success community. Couple of comments around getting weird looks from the rest of your company when you start doing this kind of process mapping. Do you have any tips or tricks to kind of get buy-in from your stakeholders to support you as you actually go through this methodology?
Absolutely. It's absolutely critical when you start one of these processes that there's an understanding of, everybody's in meetings all the time. It's really important to almost set yourself a value statement so when you start these conversations, you say, I don't want to just fix the problem you called me about. I think there's an opportunity to really improve everything you're doing. Can you take the time to help me understand what I don't know? And by enabling that user or that requester or that business leader the opportunity to really feed you information instead of pulling it out of them, it becomes very organic. You start with a statement that says, I just need to know, help me understand. People like to share. They don't want to be pulled along. And so that's why that first step of process mapping is so critical to not only understand, but then interview and have these open-ended questions. It'll make sense. And honestly, if you work with a business group or a leader or a department often enough, they start to expect it. You know, that first one is kind of like taking off a Band-Aid, but after that, they understand that, you know, my admin, my Salesforce professional wants to know, is not just trying to put out a fire.
Great. Another question from the Success community. This is a question from Carl Herman. Do you have a central place where all of your process maps live, or do you not really need to have that?
You absolutely have to, because at some point you're going to want to come back to it and reference it, or even just have a centralized project location. I like to use Chatter. We have a admin readiness group that we also use for all of our documentation and all of our processes, all of our learning. It really gives you an opportunity to store everything, centralize it, especially if you've got admins scattered regionally. You can look at your versioning, you can get collaboration going, and if you've got good Chatter adoption, you can then start sharing those documents with the people you're talking with, and they can even review and make modifications either to the document itself if you allow it, or let the collaboration turn into that process. Again, going back to my comment about everyone's been in a meeting, you know, how often have you been working on something after hours and just need someone to look at it right away the next day? Throw a Chatter post out, get some conversation going without having to schedule that meeting.
All right, one last question before we wrap up. There were some questions about Six Sigma and other recommended resources. Now, I know you posted, we have a template in the end of our deck here for resources. Do you have any other recommended paths for people to learn more about being better process mappers?
There are several really good sites. Some of them require membership, so I didn't want to focus on those too much, but I'm a member of the ASQ community. ASQ is a quality entity. It's the BAII. It's the Business Analyst. Boy, I'll add that to the feed. There's a website specifically for business analysts that has acres of documentation. The ASQ, BII. Well, Six Sigma has their own sites. Again, going to my earlier comment, there's so many ways to do this, and every time you read an article, you maybe change what you think. I definitely don't recommend assuming that everything you heard today is the right way to do it. I definitely recommend going out and doing a little research, doing a little Google development to try to figure out what hits home. But I'll get a couple links out to the community after we're done on the call.
All right, I think with that, we're getting close to time. So Squire, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone on the webinar for joining us today. Keep asking your questions in the Success community because we are actively still answering them, and we will have Squire, expert process mapper, in there answering them as well, even after we end this webinar. And as a reminder, this webinar recording and the slides will be posted in the group very shortly. So thank you everyone for joining us, and stay tuned for more future webinars at admin.salesforce.com. Thanks everyone.